Chucks turned his key in the lock at 2:47 p.m. on a Wednesday afternoon, his mind still processing the abrupt cancellation of his Port Harcourt work trip. Technical issues, they'd said. Reschedule for next week. He'd called Amara from the airport to let her know he was coming home early, but her phone had gone straight to voicemail. Probably charging it, he'd thought. She always forgot to charge her phone. The house was quiet when he entered, but not empty quiet. There was a presence to the silence, a weight that made him pause in the foyer with his overnight bag still in hand. Then he heard it, laughter drifting down from upstairs. Amara's laugh, the one she used to give him when they were dating, breathy and intimate. And then another sound, a low masculine chuckle that made every muscle in Chucks's body go rigid. He knew that laugh. He'd heard it at barbecues, at football matches, at his own wedding. Sam, his best friend since university. His children's godfather. Chucks's feet moved without conscious thought, carrying him up the stairs he'd climbed thousands of times, past the family photos on the wall. His wedding day, Amara pregnant with their first child, the four of them at the beach last Christmas. Each step felt like walking through deep water, everything moving too slow and too fast at once. The bedroom door was ajar, and through the gap, Chucks could see the foot of his bed, the expensive duvet Amara had insisted they needed, the one with the silver threading that caught the afternoon light. He pushed the door open. The hinges creaked, that sound he'd been meaning to oil for months. Two faces turned toward him in perfect synchronization. Sam, shirtless, frozen in the act of reaching for his clothes. Amara, her eyes going wide with horror, scrambling to pull the sheet up to cover herself. For a moment, the three of them formed a tableau, a photograph of devastation that would be seared into Chucks's memory forever. His knees buckled. Actually buckled, like his legs had forgotten how bones worked. He grabbed the doorframe to keep from falling, his overnight bag hitting the floor with a thud that seemed to echo through the universe. His eyes drifted to the wall beside the bed, where his children's drawings were taped, crayon stick figures labeled Daddy, Mommy, and me in his 6-year-old daughter's careful handwriting. Another drawing from his 4-year-old son, the same family configuration in brighter colors. And suddenly, horribly, Chucks's mind began calculating. His daughter had Amara's eyes, but not his nose. His son had neither of their smiles. He'd always assumed they'd inherited from grandparents, that genetic lottery of features. But standing there, looking at Sam's face, really looking at it for the first time, he saw his son's chin, his daughter's ears. The shape of Sam's hands matched the small hands that had grabbed his fingers learning to walk. Chucks. Amara's voice broke through his spiraling thoughts, but he couldn't process words yet. Couldn't process anything beyond the nauseating possibility crystallizing in his mind. One of those me's might not be his. Or both. Oh God, both. Chucks, please, let me explain. Amara was out of bed now, wrapped in the sheet, reaching for him with one hand while the other clutched the fabric to her chest. Sam had his pants on, was pulling his shirt over his head with shaking hands, his mouth opening and closing, but no words coming out. Chucks held up one hand. Just one hand, palm out, and both of them stopped moving. Stopped talking. The silence that filled the room was worse than shouting would have been, worse than rage or violence or any normal human reaction. It was the silence of something fundamental breaking, a silence so complete it had texture and weight. He walked to the closet with mechanical precision, pulled out his old duffel bag from university, and began packing. Underwear, socks, shirts. His movements were methodical, almost robotic. Amara followed him around the room, her voice rising in pitch with each plea. It was a mistake, Chucks, please, it was just one time. Please don't do this, think about the children. Chucks, please, we can fix this, we can go to counseling, please just talk to me. Sam tried once, his voice cracking. Man, I'm sorry, I don't know what. Chucks turned his head slowly, his eyes meeting Sam's, and whatever Sam saw in that look made him stumble backward and fall silent. It was a look that said, I don't know you. I never knew you. You're dead to me. All communicated without a single word. Chucks zipped the duffel bag, slung it over his shoulder, and walked out of the bedroom. He passed the children's rooms. They were at his mother's for the afternoon. Thank God they weren't home for this, and paused at the top of the stairs. His phone was in his pocket. He pulled it out, looked at it for a long moment, then set it carefully on the hallway table. He didn't want to be reached, didn't want to be found, didn't want to exist in the same reality where phones rang and messages came through and life continued like normal. Halfway down the stairs, Chucks realized he was barefoot. His shoes were by the front door, but his feet had carried him this far without them. And somehow putting on shoes felt like too much civilization, too much pretending the world made sense. He walked out of his own house barefoot, the concrete of the driveway rough and real against his skin, the only thing that felt true in a world that had just revealed itself to be built entirely on lies. His car was in the driveway. He got in, started the engine, and sat there for a full minute, his hands gripping the steering wheel so hard his knuckles went white. Through the rearview mirror, he could see Amara in the doorway, still wrapped in that sheet, her mouth moving in words he couldn't hear and didn't want to. Sam appeared behind her, pulling on his jacket, and the sight of them standing together in his doorway, framed by his home, was so obscene that Chuck's felt bile rise in his throat. He put the car in reverse and drove away from the only life he'd ever known, toward a future that was nothing but questions he was terrified to have answered. The motel room cost $45 a night and smelled like old cigarettes and industrial cleaner. Chuck sat on the edge of the bed, the springs creaked ominously, and stared at the mirror bolted to the wall opposite. The man looking back at him was a stranger. Same face, same body, but the eyes were different. Hollow. Haunted. He'd always thought heartbreak was a metaphor, but sitting there in that cheap motel room, Chucks could feel his chest actually aching, a physical pain that radiated from his sternum like he'd been shot. He couldn't sleep. Every time he closed his eyes, he saw them, Sam and Amara, tangled in sheets that smelled like his laundry detergent, in a bed he'd assembled himself 3 years ago, under a ceiling he'd painted. And worse than that image were the questions that followed. How long? How many times? In his bed? In his house? While he was at work? While he was traveling? While he was downstairs watching football, believing his wife was upstairs folding laundry? But the worst question, the one that made his hands shake and his vision blur, was the one about his children. Chisholm and Chitty. His daughter and his son. His babies. Were they his babies? He'd been there for both births, had cut both umbilical cords, had walked the floors at 3 a.m. with both of them screaming against his shoulder. He'd taught Chisholm to ride a bike. He'd read bedtime stories to Chitty every night for 4 years. They called him Daddy. But did they share his blood? At 4 a.m., unable to bear the uncertainty another second, Chucks pulled out the laptop he'd grabbed from his car and searched paternity test discrete Legos. The results showed dozens of options. He chose one with next-day delivery, express processing for an additional fee that he paid without thinking. The confirmation email said the kit would arrive by Friday. 2 days. He had to survive 2 days of not knowing. When Friday came, Chucks drove to his house while Amara was at work and the kids were at school. He used his key, he was still paying the mortgage, after all, and walked through rooms that felt like a museum of his old life. Everything was exactly as he'd left it. The breakfast dishes still in the sink. The kids' backpacks by the door. The normalcy of it was surreal, obscene even. He found their toothbrushes in the bathroom. Chisholm's pink one with princesses, Chitty's blue one with cartoon cars. His hands shook so badly, he had to set the kit down and breathe deeply for a minute before he could continue. The swabbing process was simple. 2 samples per child, sealed in separate containers, labeled with numbers instead of names. Clinical. Scientific. The opposite of fatherhood, which was supposed to be about love and trust and certainty, not laboratory results and probability percentages. Before leaving, Chuck stood in the doorway of his children's shared room. Their beds were made. Amara was meticulous about that. Stuffed animals lined up. Books on shelves. He'd built those shelves. He'd painted these walls. He'd assembled every piece of furniture, hung every picture, created this space with his own hands because he'd wanted his children to have the perfect room. But maybe they weren't his children. Maybe he'd built this shrine to another man's bloodline. The email arrived 9 days later. Subject line: Lab results, case hashtag A47293. Chuck stared at his phone screen for a full 5 minutes before opening it. His thumb hovered over the notification, and in that space between knowing and not knowing, he existed in a quantum state where his children were simultaneously his and not his, where his entire life was both real and a lie. He opened the email at 6:23 a.m. on a Saturday. He was alone in the small apartment he'd rented week to week, coffee growing cold in his hand, Legos traffic already humming outside his window. The attachment was a PDF, professional letterhead, charts and numbers and scientific language. And at the bottom of each report, in bold text that seemed to burn into his retinas: probability of paternity, 0%. Conclusion: The tested man is excluded as the biological father. 2 reports. 2 children. 2 identical conclusions. Not one. Not even one. Chuck set his phone down very carefully on the table, as if it might explode if handled roughly. Then he sat back in his chair and stared at nothing, his mind absolutely blank, a white noise of denial that was the only thing standing between him and total collapse. The sun rose fully, painting his small apartment in shades of gold and orange. Beautiful in different light. Chucks didn't move. Couldn't move. The coffee went from warm to room temperature to cold. His phone buzzed with messages. Amara, probably, or his mother, or work. But the sounds came from very far away, from a world he no longer inhabited. 6 years. 6 years of fatherhood erased by 2 pieces of paper and some statistical analysis. 6 years of loving children who shared none of his DNA. 6 years of being deceived so completely, so thoroughly, that his entire identity as a man, as a husband, as a father, had been built on lies. And Sam, his best friend, his brother in all but blood, had known. Had known every time he came to their house for dinner. Had known every time he played with the kids, calling them godchildren, while they were actually his children. Had known and said nothing, done nothing, continued the deception year after year after year. When Chucks finally moved again, it was nearly noon. His body ached like he'd been in a physical fight. He picked up his phone with numb fingers and opened his contacts. Sam's name was right there, saved under brother from another mother, with a photo from their university days, both of them grinning, arms around each other's shoulders, young and stupid and believing friendship meant something. Chucks deleted the contact. Then he blocked the number. Then he opened WhatsApp and deleted their entire conversation history. Thousands of messages spanning 15 years of friendship. Then he blocked him there too. And on Instagram. And Facebook. And everywhere else their lives had been digitally entangled. Each deletion felt like performing surgery on himself without anesthesia. Necessary. Agonizing. Final. Amara's contact stayed on his phone, but only because divorce required communication. He changed her name from My Heart Red Heart to simply Amara. No emoji. No affection. Just a name attached to a number attached to a person who'd destroyed him. Sam called anyway, somehow getting through on Chucks' work phone 2 weeks after the DNA results. Chucks saw Sam Okafor on the caller ID and nearly didn't answer. But something, maybe morbid curiosity, maybe the need for confrontation, made him pick up. Man, we need to talk. Sam's voice was strained, pleading. What happened? It was a mistake. A terrible mistake. But we can fix this, you and me, we're brothers, we can. You're right, Chucks interrupted, his voice so calm it surprised him. It was a mistake. The biggest one of your life. Because now you have 2 children you'll never be a father to, and I have 6 years I'll never get back, and Amara has a destroyed marriage. So yes, Sam. It was a mistake. Your mistake. Live with it. Chucks, please, just let me explain. Explain what? That you fucked my wife in my bed. That you fathered 2 children, and let me believe they were mine? That you came to my house, ate my food, accepted my friendship, all while knowing you'd betrayed me in the worst possible way. Chucks' calm was cracking, rage bleeding through. What exactly do you think you can explain that would make any of that acceptable? Sam was crying now. Chucks could hear it in his voice, the wet hitching sounds of a grown man sobbing. Once, that sound would have moved him. Once, he would have done anything to help his friend. Now, it just made him tired. I never meant for it to happen. It just, things with Amara and me, they just happened. And then, things with Amara and you? Chucks repeated slowly. So it wasn't just that one time I caught you. It was ongoing. A relationship. An affair. The silence on the other end was confirmation enough. Chucks felt something cold and hard settle in his chest, displacing the last remnants of the man he used to be. How long, Sam? How long were you sleeping with my wife? 7 years. The whisper was barely audible. It started 7 years ago, before Chisholm was born. Chucks, I'm so sorry Chucks hung up. 7 years. His entire marriage had been a lie. Every family dinner, every holiday, every milestone contaminated. He stood up from his desk, walked to the bathroom, and vomited until there was nothing left. Then he washed his face, straightened his tie, and went back to work. Because the alternative was collapse, and collapse was a luxury he couldn't afford. Not yet. First, he had to dismantle the life those 2 had built on his back. Then he could fall apart. 3 weeks later, Chucks was called into his CEO's office. He'd been expecting termination, His performance had been erratic since the discovery, his usual sharp focus dulled by the constant background noise of betrayal. Instead, Mr. Adeyemi smiled and gestured to a chair. "Chucks, I'll be direct. We're opening a new regional office in Lagos mainland, and I want you to head it. Regional director, full relocation package, 30% salary increase. What do you say?" Chucks stared at his boss, his mind struggling to process this unexpected turn. A promotion. Now, when his life was in ruins. The irony was so perfect it almost made him laugh. "When would I start?" 2 weeks. "I know it's fast, but you're the best operations manager we have. This office needs someone who can build from the ground up. Someone trustworthy." That word, trustworthy, hit different now. "I'll do it," Chucks heard himself say. "I'll take it." Mr. Adeyemi's smile widened. "Excellent. HR will handle the details. Congratulations, Chucks. You've earned this." Walking out of that office, Chucks felt the first genuine emotion he'd experienced since the DNA results: determination. Not happiness, not pride, but the cold, hard resolve of a man who'd just been handed an escape route and fully intended to use it. He would relocate, start over, build a new life in a new part of the city where Amara and Sam didn't exist, where he wasn't the man whose wife cuckolded him with his best friend, where his identity wasn't defined by betrayal. That night, he visited his mother. She took one look at his face and knew something catastrophic had happened. Chucks told her everything: the affair, the DNA results, the 7 years of lies. His mother, a strong Igbo woman who'd raised 4 children alone after his father died, sat in silence for a long time. Then she slapped her own chest, her eyes blazing with tears and fury. "They spat on your name," she whispered. "On our family name. On everything we taught you about honor and integrity." "Mama, I don't know what to do," Chucks admitted, his voice breaking for the first time since this began. "I love those children. I still love them. But they're not mine. How do I just stop being their father?" His mother gripped his hands, her fingers strong despite her age. "You mourn, my son. You mourn the life you thought you had. But then you rebuild. Not with anger. Anger will consume you. But with success. With dignity. You become so successful, so complete, that their betrayal becomes irrelevant. That's the revenge that matters. Living well. Living better. Showing them what they lost when they chose deception over truth." Chucks nodded slowly. His mother was right. Rage would destroy him. But success, cold, methodical, undeniable success, that was something he could build. That was something he could control. He left his mother's house with a plan crystallizing in his mind. He would take the promotion, move to the new place, cut all ties except the legal ones required for divorce. And he would build himself into someone so fundamentally different, so clearly evolved beyond the man they'd betrayed, that looking at him would hurt them more than any words ever could. The universe, Chucks discovered, had a sense of irony. 2 months after his relocation to Lagos mainland, after he'd moved into a modern apartment with floor-to-ceiling windows and a gym membership he actually used, after he'd thrown himself into work with monastic focus, he received a message from a mutual friend. "Have you heard about Sam? His business is collapsing." Chucks hadn't heard, hadn't wanted to know, but curiosity made him look. Sam's construction company, which had been thriving, was suddenly hemorrhaging clients. Permits were being delayed. Suppliers were pulling out. The business that had made Sam wealthy was crumbling, and rumors swirled about why. Chucks made some discreet inquiries and learned something interesting. One of Sam's biggest clients, a developer Chucks had personally introduced to Sam years ago, had abruptly terminated their contract citing personal reasons and loss of trust. Chucks hadn't said anything to that developer. Hadn't had to. The man had called Chucks to congratulate him on the promotion, and during that call had casually asked, "How's your friend Sam these days? Haven't heard from him." And Chucks, his voice carefully neutral, had simply said, "We're no longer friends. Personal reasons. I'd rather not discuss it." The developer, shrewd and observant, had read between those lines and made his own decisions. Other dominoes fell similarly. In the interconnected world of Lagos business, reputation was currency, and word spread quietly that Sam Okafor was not a man to be trusted. Chucks never said anything directly. Never had to. His silence, his sudden and complete absence from Sam's life after 15 years of brotherhood, spoke volumes to people who knew how to listen. And they listened. And they pulled back. And they stopped answering Sam's calls. Chucks told himself he felt nothing about this. That Sam's downfall was natural consequences, karma doing its work. But late at night, in his new apartment that still echoed with emptiness, he'd allow himself a small, cold smile. Not triumph. Not quite. But acknowledgement. The universe was balancing its books. She showed up at his new office on a Thursday afternoon, looking nothing like the woman he'd married. Thinner. Harder around the edges. Makeup couldn't quite hide the shadows under her eyes. Chuck's secretary buzzed him. "Sir, there's an Amara Okonkwo here to see you. She says it's urgent." Chuck's almost said no. Almost had security escort her out. But something, maybe the memory of who she used to be, maybe simple human decency, made him agree to 5 minutes. She walked into his corner office, her eyes immediately taking in the success on display. The view, the modern furniture, the awards already lining one shelf. "Chucks," she breathed, "look at you. Regional director. I'm so proud." "Don't," he interrupted, his voice flat. "You don't get to be proud. You don't get to feel anything about my success. Why are you here, Amara?" Her composure cracked. "Sam left me. He's broke, his business failed, and he left me with the kids and no support. Chucks, I'm drowning. The mortgage, the school fees, everything. I can't do this alone. I need help. I need you." The audacity of it stole his breath. "You need me," he repeated slowly. "Where was that need when you were sleeping with Sam in our bed? Where was it during 7 years of lies? Where was it when you let me love children that weren't mine? They are yours." Amara cried out. "Maybe not biologically, but you raised them, Chucks. You're the only father they know. They're asking about you every day." Chisholm cries herself to sleep. "Chitty doesn't understand why Daddy isn't coming home. You can't just abandon them, because they're not my children," Chucks finished coldly. "And you're right, I raised them. I love them. But every moment of that love was built on your lies. You took my devotion, my trust, my fatherhood, and you used it to cover your affair. So no, Amara. I'm not your backup plan. I'm not your safety net. I'm not the man who saves you from the consequences of your choices." She tried to touch him, reaching across his desk with a desperate hand. Chucks leaned back, physical distance between them, and something in his face made her withdraw. "I'm sorry," she whispered, putting. "I know that doesn't fix anything, but I'm so sorry. I was weak. I was stupid. I destroyed everything good in my life. But please, Chucks, if not for me, then for the kids. You should have thought about the kids before you slept with Sam," Chucks said, standing up to signal the conversation was over. "I'm not abandoning them. My lawyer is arranging supervised visitation because despite everything, I did raise them, and they're innocent in this. But you and we're done. The divorce papers are being filed next week. You'll get what the court determines is fair. Nothing more. Nothing less. Now please leave my office." Amara left sobbing, and Chuck sat back down at his desk, his hands shaking slightly. That was the first time he'd seen her since walking out of their house barefoot 3 months ago. The first time he'd looked into the eyes of the woman who'd destroyed him. And he'd felt nothing. No love. No hate. Just vast, empty indifference. It should have felt like victory. Instead, it just felt sad. 6 months after everything fell apart, Chucks found himself in another motel room. This one significantly nicer, in a hotel where he was speaking at a regional business conference. By cosmic coincidence, it was the same hotel where he'd caught Amara and Sam. He'd hesitated before accepting the speaking invitation, but his mother's words echoed. Living well is the best revenge. After his keynote on operational excellence, delivered to applause and business cards pressed into his hand, Chucks returned to his room and stood in front of the bathroom mirror. The same cheap fluorescent lighting that had shown him a broken man 6 months ago now illuminated someone different. Physically, he'd transformed. The gym membership had reshaped his body, better sleep had cleared his eyes, success had straightened his spine. But the real change was internal. The man looking back at him wasn't running from pain anymore. He'd walked through it, absorbed it, and emerged hardened but not bitter. His phone buzzed. A text from an unknown number. "I'm sorry." Just 2 words. Chuck stared at them for a long moment, then typed a response. "I'm not. I found myself." He hit send, then blocked the number without waiting for a reply. Because it was true. In losing everything, wife, children, best friend, the entire life he'd built, he'd found something more valuable, himself. Not the version of himself that accommodated betrayal, that ignored red flags, that prioritized peace over truth. But the core of who he was when everything else was stripped away. His mother had been right about revenge. Success was sweeter than anger. Walking into that conference as regional director, shaking hands with industry leaders, being respected and valued for his competence. That was worth more than any confrontation, any explosion of rage, any attempt to hurt the people who'd hurt him. They'd taken his past. He was building a future they couldn't touch. A knock at his door pulled him from his thoughts. Chucks opened it to find Tonia, a consultant he'd met earlier at the conference. She smiled, holding up 2 coffees. Thought you might need this after that keynote. Mind if I come in? I have some ideas about your operational framework I'd love to discuss. Chuck stepped aside, welcoming her in. They talked for 3 hours, about business, about Legos, about building something meaningful in a world that often felt chaotic and cruel. Tonia had her own story of betrayal, an ex-husband who'd drained their joint accounts and disappeared. She'd rebuilt too, had climbed back from nothing to something substantial. We're not broken, she said as the night grew late. We're reborn. Stronger. Clearer. Better. They weren't dating. Weren't even flirting, really. But sitting there, talking to someone who understood resilience, who'd faced devastation and chosen to build rather than collapse, Chucks felt something he hadn't felt in months. Hope. Not for romance necessarily, but for the future. For the possibility that what came next might be better than what came before. That the life he was building in the rubble of his destroyed marriage might actually be the life he was meant to live all along. 1 year after walking out of his house barefoot, Chucks received an envelope delivered by courier to his office. Inside was a handwritten letter, pages long, Amara's familiar script filling every line. He almost threw it away unread. Almost. But curiosity, or maybe the need for closure, made him sit down and read it. The letter was an apology, thorough and devastating. She took responsibility for everything, the affair, the lies, the destruction of their family. She didn't make excuses, didn't blame circumstances or temporary weakness. She owned her choices completely. I destroyed the best man I ever knew, she wrote. I destroyed my children's father. I destroyed myself. And I have to live with that every day. I know you can't forgive me. I don't expect you to. I just needed you to know that I see clearly and completely what I did. And I'm sorry. Not because I want you back. Not because I think apologies fix anything. But because you deserve to hear it. The letter went on to describe how Sam had indeed left her, how the financial struggles were real, how the children asked about him constantly. Chisholm understands now that you're not her biological father, Amara wrote. I had to tell her. She's 8 years old and asking questions I couldn't dodge anymore. She cried for 3 days. Not because she loves you less, but because she's terrified you'll stop loving her. I told her you'd never stop. Was I right? Can you still love them, even knowing the truth? Chuck set the letter down and walked to his window, looking out at Legos sprawling below. Could he still love those children? The question had haunted him for a year. He'd seen them twice in supervised visits, awkward meetings where Chisholm was quiet and Chitty clung to him. With desperate intensity. It had hurt. God, it had hurt to hug them, to smell their familiar child smell, to see their faces light up at Daddy. Knowing they weren't his, knowing their existence was rooted in betrayal. But they were also innocent. They hadn't asked to be born into deception. And the love he'd given them for 6 years, that had been real, even if the foundation was lies. He couldn't just turn it off. Couldn't pretend those years hadn't existed. The question wasn't whether he loved them. He did. The question was what to do with that love, how to maintain connection without allowing Amara back into his life, how to father children who weren't his without betraying his own healing. He called his lawyer. The supervised visitations, I want them to continue. Monthly at minimum. I'll pay child support through the court, but it goes into a trust for the kid's education, not to Amara directly. And I want it clear. This is about the children, not reconciliation. The divorce proceeds. Is that possible? It's possible, his lawyer confirmed. You're a good man, Chucks. Was he? Chucks wasn't sure. Maybe he was just a man trying to do right by children who called him daddy, even though biology said he wasn't. Maybe that was enough. That evening, Chucks did something he'd avoided for a year. He pulled out the box of photos he'd taken from the house, birthday parties, first days of school, family vacations. He looked at each one, letting himself remember the joy without denying the pain. Then he took the letter from Amara, read it one final time, and carefully placed it in his fireplace. He watched it burn, the paper curling and blackening, her words disappearing into ash and smoke. Forgiveness doesn't mean return. he murmured to the empty room. It means I'm not carrying your weight anymore. And it was true. He'd forgiven her, not because she deserved it, but because holding on to rage was like drinking poison and expecting her to die. But forgiveness didn't mean reconciliation. Didn't mean trust could be rebuilt. It just meant he was letting go of the anger that had been eating him alive. His phone rang. Tonia. They'd been seeing each other for 3 months now, taking it slow, building something careful and honest. Still coming to dinner tonight? She asked. I made that jollof rice you can't stop talking about. Chuck smiled, a real smile, the kind that reached his eyes. I'll be there in 20 minutes. He hung up, grabbed his keys, and took one last look around his apartment. It wasn't the house he'd lost. It was better. It was his. Built by him, paid for by him, filled with only things and people he'd chosen. This was his life now. Not the one he'd planned. Not the one he'd expected. But maybe, just maybe, the one he was meant to have all along. Walking out into the Lagos night, Chuck felt something he hadn't felt since that horrible Wednesday afternoon a year ago. Peace. Not happiness. Not yet. Maybe not ever completely. But peace. The storm was over. He'd survived. And on the other side of survival was something unexpected. A future. Not the future he'd imagined, but a future nonetheless. Open. Unwritten. His. The final message from that unknown number sat in his deleted texts, unread by anyone but him. I'm sorry. And his response, true in ways he couldn't have imagined when he sent it. I'm not. I found myself. Because he had. In the wreckage of betrayal, in the ruins of trust, in the ashes of his old life, he'd found the man he was meant to be. Stronger. Clearer. Free. And that, Chucks realized as he drove through the city lights toward dinner with a woman who understood resilience, was worth everything he'd lost. He'd paid a terrible price for this clarity. But sitting there, feeling genuinely okay for the first time in a year, he knew something profound. Sometimes you have to lose everything to discover what you're truly made of. And Chucks had discovered he was made of something unbreakable. The people who'd tried to destroy him had only succeeded in revealing his strength. He turned off his phone, didn't need it anymore tonight, and walked into his new life with his head up and his heart, if not whole, then at least healing. The sound he'd never forget, that laughter drifting down the stairs, that masculine chuckle that had shattered his world, no longer had power over him. It was just a memory now, painful but distant, like a scar that had finally stopped hurting. Amara and Sam existed somewhere in Lagos, dealing with consequences of their own making, but they existed in a separate universe from his. The children would always be complicated, always be a tender place in his heart, but he'd found a way to love them without betraying himself. Monthly visits, trust funds for their education, birthday cards signed Uncle Chuck's, because that's what felt honest. It wasn't perfect, but it was real. And real, he'd learned, was more valuable than any pretty lie. Tonia was waiting at her door when he arrived, that smile that didn't pity or judge, just welcomed. They'd built something fragile but genuine. Two people who'd been broken by betrayal learning to trust again, slowly, carefully, with eyes wide open. As they sat down to dinner, talking about everything and nothing, Chucks realized this was what healing looked like. Not a dramatic moment of triumph, not revenge perfectly executed, but quiet evenings with someone who saw your scars and didn't flinch. His mother had been right all along. The best revenge wasn't hurting the people who hurt you. It was building a life so full, so genuine, so completely yours that their betrayal became just a chapter in your origin story rather than your ending. Chucks had been destroyed a year ago in that bedroom doorway, barefoot and broken. But from those ashes, he'd built something his betrayers could never touch. A man who knew his own worth, who demanded honesty, who chose himself without apology. They'd tried to break him. Instead, they'd freed him. And that freedom, sitting there with jollof rice and genuine laughter and a future that belonged entirely to him, was the sweetest victory of all.